Dan Sullivan is the co-founder of Strategic Coach. Strategic Coach is the #1 entrepreneurial coaching company in the world. Dan and I wrote a book together called Who Not How. This came out in 2020. Since then, it's sold over 130,000 copies. And recently, Dan and I wrote a book based on this little book. Dan has these little books. This one is called The Gap in the Gain. I first read this book back in 2018, and it completely blew my mind. I wrote several articles about it on Medium, and those articles were read near 1 million times. The publisher of this book is Hay House. I recently signed a 4-book deal with Hay House, and this is our next book. Dan and I have a collaboration ongoing, and this book comes out in October of 2021. Here is the Amazon picture of it. It's a different cover, obviously. But in this video, I'm gonna share 5 lessons I learned from writing The Gap in the Gain with Dan Sullivan. So this is my 2nd book with Dan. This is my 4th major book. Writing this book changed my life. Not only the content I wrote, content is life-changing. The Gap in the Gain is a mind-blowing concept. It will blow your mind, it will transform your life. By the way, you can get a free copy of this down below. On the Strategic Coach website, all you gotta do is put your email in, link down below. You can read this for free. And I hope you read the version that me and Dan wrote. But in this video, I just wanted to share with you 5 lessons I learned by writing this book. It took me about 6 months to write this book. It was a very challenging book to write because the concept is so powerful. It's so deep, it's so transformative that it just changed me. It changed my life in writing it. The first lesson I learned in writing this book is actually a separate Dan concept. It's called Always Be the Buyer. I don't write about Always Be the Buyer in The Gap in the Gain, but Dan's concept of Always Be the Buyer is that you highly specify your success criteria. You've got to be very clear on what you want, and then you use that as the standard for everything you do. In every relationship, there are buyers and sellers. You want to be the buyer. The buyer is the person who can walk away. The buyer is the person who knows what they want, they're clear on it, and they're not desperate. The seller is the person who's desperately trying to get the buyer to buy. So for example, if you're a car salesman, you're the seller. You're very much trying to get a person to buy, but if you're the buyer, you can say no. If you're the buyer, you can walk away. And the more you specify specifically what you want and you use that as your criteria for success, then you can be the buyer in everything in your life. And while I was writing this book, it just became very clear to me, number 1, how important it is to define your success criteria, to define what success is for you, to define what must be true in order for this to be what you want. This is true in all relationships. If you're trying to be in a romantic relationship, you've got to specify, what does success look like for you? In a business relationship, what does success look like? If you're not clear on your success criteria, if you're not clear on your definition of success and essentially your standards, then you're going to get something that you maybe don't want, or maybe you'll become the seller and you'll become desperate to be in that relationship. I was actually the seller for quite a while. I wrote a book called Personality Isn't Permanent. That book was published with Penguin Random House, which is one of the big publishers, under a specific imprint, which is one of the biggest imprints. And I became the seller in that relationship. I became desperate to be in that relationship. When you're the seller, you bend over backwards to be in that relationship because you're desperate for that relationship. You feel like you need that relationship. When you become the buyer, you operate based on want, not need. And so when you're the buyer, you say, this is what I want. If you can't give it to me, I'll go somewhere else. I'm clear on what I want. I'm not desperate for it. But when you're the seller, you become desperate. You become willing to essentially give up your freedoms to have this thing or have this relationship because you feel like you need it. And anytime you're operating out of need, you've given your freedom to something else. You've given your agency, you've given your hope, you've given all of those things to something else. And that's actually the mindset that I had with my former publisher, but writing this book, The Gap in the Gain, trained me more to be the buyer. And I'm gonna explain to you the results it got. So this is Personality Isn't Permanent. This is a book that I wrote that came out in 2020. And in order for me to want to stay with that publisher, because it is one of the top business publishers, I became willing to get a very bad book deal for my next book. They actually offered me $100,000 less to write the next book, and they would not allow me to write the book I really wanted. I offered them multiple books. I wanted to write a book called The Necessity of Hope. I wanted to write a book all about the research on the future self, and they kept rejecting my ideas. Again, the buyer is the one that can walk away. The buyer is the one who rejects. I was getting rejected, but I kept bending over backwards because I'm like, I feel like I need this publisher. And so ultimately, I was desperate and I was willing to write a book I didn't ultimately want to write, and I got offered $100,000 less for my next book. They offered me $100,000 less than they offered me for this book. And I accepted it because I was the seller in that relationship. I was not the one who could walk away. And that publisher is so prestigious that they can be the buyer in most of their relationships. They can set the terms. The buyer sets the terms. And the buyer can walk away. I was so desperate to stay in the relationship that I was willing to write a book I didn't really want to write for way less money than I had even previously gotten, because I was the one who felt like I needed them. Well, in writing the book, The Gap and the Gain, I learned to more fully specify my success criteria and to ultimately define for myself what success means. By living my life in the gain, what Dan Sullivan means being in the gain means I was measuring my own progress backwards. Rather than comparing myself to other people, I compared myself to where I was before. Well, last year, in 2020, these two books came out. So this book came out in June and this book came out in October. And this book is with Hay House. Hay House is the publisher who ultimately I recently signed a 4-book deal with. But this book has done very well. It's sold over 130,000 copies. It's done very well. It's ultimately reset my trajectory as a writer. The owner of Hay House, the CEO, came to me and he said, Ben, we are very thrilled with your writing. We want all of your books to be with us. And so I was like, this is interesting. And so ultimately I was able to set the terms. I was able to say, look, here is what's going to ultimately be required in order for me to become a full-time Hay House author. I want a 4-book contract. I want to get paid this much. And if you're willing to do this, I will get out of my contract with my other publisher. I basically set the terms and they agreed. They said, yes, we would love to do that. And so then I went and I told my other publisher, I want out of that deal. And they were kind of shocked. They were disappointed because they're the ones who are used to being the buyer. They're not the ones who are used to being rejected. They're the ones who are used to setting the terms, which rightfully so. They're like one of the top business publishers in the world. And so they're used to being the buyer, not the seller. But because I wrote this book and I learned to be the buyer and I learned to set my own success criteria, I was able to say, I can walk away from this relationship now. I no longer need this, and I also no longer want this. I actually want something else. I've got something better where I set the terms more for myself rather than that I'm willing to bend over backwards. So I was able to get a 4-book deal and make enormously more money for every single book on that 4-book deal than the 1 book that my former publisher was willing to pay me. And also, with my new publisher, with Hay House, they allow me the full freedom to write whatever I want to write. So not only do I get to write whatever I want, I get paid more, I get to write more frequently at the frequency I want. It's also just been a much better situation. So I got to set the terms and I got to lay out what success was for me, and then I was able to reject anything less than that. There's one thing that's really important about all of this. So Adam Grant, he's an organizational psychologist, and he recently wrote a book called Think Again. And one of the things he talks about is that people often don't reset their mindsets, their beliefs. We update things like our technology all the time. We get new cars, we get new iPhone updates, but we don't update our belief systems. One of the things he said in the book that was pretty funny is he said, you would laugh at someone if they were still using Windows 95. But the question is, how many of your beliefs that were developed in 1995 do you still have? Obviously, a lot of people watching this might not have even been born in 1995, but the point exists, how many of your beliefs have you not updated in 3, 4, 5 years? Alain de Botton, the British philosopher, said, if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough. Ray Dalio said, if you don't think that a lot of what you were doing was stupid last year, then you haven't learned enough. So hopefully you're updating your belief system, your mindset, your success criteria, your measurements of success, your standards, your expectations. Hopefully you're updating those through powerful experience. And you will be updating those if you're someone who's approach motivated. Approach motivation in psychology means you're clear on your future self and you're approaching that future self and you're having peak experiences. Avoid motivation means you're avoiding failure. If you're willing to experience failure and learn, you can transform amazingly, and you can use those experiences to clarify, specify what you want. And then you can use that as your new standard for how you live. And it's okay if you reject things that your former self used to accept. In fact, you should. Brian Tracy has a concept he calls zero-based thinking. Zero-based thinking is the idea that knowing what you know now, what are the relationships, the obligations, the commitments that you would not get involved in based on what you know now. You now know things your former self didn't know. You've got clear success criteria than your former self had. You can reject things that your former self used to accept. That doesn't mean you reject your former self. You love your former self. You're in the gain about your former self. You love and respect your former self, but you know things that your former self didn't know. You're clear, you're more confident, you're more capable, you've got a better situation, hopefully. You've got better knowledge, and so you can say no to things that your former self used to say yes to. bad behavior, bad relationships, bad situations. You don't have to accept the terms of what your former self used to accept because you're now in a better place. So that's the first lesson I learned. The second thing I learned by writing The Gap and the Gain is the concept of reference points. We all have reference points. And a reference point is basically the standard by which something is measured. And as a society, we're trained as people to have external reference points. We go through the public education system and there are reference points. We're graded on tests. We're graded against like percentile ranks and how we rank against the other kids our age throughout the entire nation. And we're competing and comparing ourselves with other people, and we're trying to beat other people. And those reference points are not set by us, but by the public education system and by society at large. And so we are trained as children to have external reference points. And there's a lot written to the idea that public education can kill creativity. It can kill intrinsic motivation because you stop asking real questions and instead you start looking for the answers. And so we're trained as a society to have external reference points. And even social media trains us to have external reference points. We have all these ideals of society, what the good life looks like, that we start seeking what society has trained us and manipulated us to want. There's even a great documentary called The Social Dilemma that talks about how social media is literally trained to manipulate our identity, our desires, and our behaviors. Social media is trained to manipulate what we want, who we are, what we strive for. And there's billions of dollars in ads to manipulate our identity and to shift our reference points. And so it's good to actually have your reference point shifted. It's good to get education and to seek education, but ultimately here's the key. And this is one of the things I learned and what I loved in writing The Gap and the Gain is that you ultimately want your reference point to not be external, but you want your reference point to be internal. You are the thing you measure yourself against, and more specifically, you measure yourself against your former self. Rather than measuring yourself against someone else, rather than measuring yourself against some ideal in society, you measure yourself against where you were before. Ernest Hemingway, the novelist, said that true nobility is not being superior to other people. True nobility is about being superior to your former self. So when you make yourself the reference point, and when you start measuring yourself only against your former self, that's what Dan would call being in the game. Then you're measuring your progress against where you were before. You're measuring your progress against your former self, not against anything else. What happens is then you become what psychologists call self-determined. You stop paying so much attention to other people. You start just measuring your own progress. And that leads to intrinsic motivation. It leads to increased motivation. It also allows you to see your own progress, and then you can set your own goals rather than having your goals be dictated by school or by social media or by what your friends are doing. And once you start setting your own intrinsically motivated goals, you start to have way more passion and excitement towards your life. And so it is important that you have an internal reference point, that you are the one referencing against yourself rather than being so spread thin by what society has told you success is. You want to be the one who determines what success is. So that's the number 2 thing that I learned writing The Gap and the Gain. The third thing I learned writing The Gap and the Gain is just how much people can truly transform. Human beings can transform, not only us, people can transform way more than you think they can. I believe that I transformed immensely by writing The Gap and the Gain, and also just over these last 6 months. I'm shocked. As Elaine Day Button said, if you're not embarrassed by where you were 6 months ago, you didn't learn enough. Now, being embarrassed by your former self, you actually don't want to be embarrassed by your former self because you don't want to be in the gap about your past. Being in the gap means that you're unhappy with or measuring your former self against an ideal. No, you don't want to be embarrassed by your former self, but you want to be shocked at how different you are compared to your former self. You want to be shocked and amazed at how much you've transformed. But not only can you transform, but your work can transform. In psychology, there's a concept called deliberate practice, and deliberate practice is how you ultimately go from mediocre at something to becoming world-class. And you can become world-class at something through practice, through feedback specifically. One of the things that I learned writing this book is how much this book could transform from draft to draft to draft when you are open to fast feedback. And also, there's a lot said about what a transformational relationship is. You want to be in transformational relationships, not transactional ones. And a transformational relationship means that there's a lot of feedback, and you can engage in what's called ideological conflict. You can actually engage in conflict. That's one of the key aspects of a good meeting or of a good relationship is you can engage in conflict and ultimately get to the truth. And the conflict is about ideas. It's not about the relationships. It's not emotionally driven. It's about what is the truth of this or how can we make this better? Even Adam Grant, again, back to his book, Think Again, he talked about children and when they're willing to get feedback. And if you're willing to go through something and create multiple iterations, the first draft should not be what you think the potential is. None of us are first draft people. If you can get feedback, you can transform something, and you should be willing to get 3, 4, 5, many drafts of even your belief about something. But even little kids, there was a study where little kids were drawing just butterflies. And once they got feedback, they could update it. And by the 4th or 5th draft, it was kind of stunning how good a first grader could draw a butterfly. If they were willing to create multiple drafts, update their thinking, it's crazy how much things can transform. And that's one thing I learned is not only can my own thinking transform once I became in the gain rather than being in the gap, and once I started making myself my own reference point, but once I had fast feedback loops and was in a transformational relationship, feedback loops with my editor, feedback with Dan and the others about my thinking, the book was changed so much. I mean, it's a fundamentally different book in all dimensions from even the last draft. But 5 drafts ago, it was totally different. And I thought that 5 drafts ago, it was interesting. It's crazy how different it is now. So one thing I just learned is how crazy, how fast and how fundamental things can transform. The 4th thing I learned is more about book writing specifically, and that's the idea that you need to be ruthless in your editing. Ruthless about getting to what Greg McKeown would call the essential. So as Greg McKeown says in the book Essentialism, you've got to be a ruthless editor of your life. You've got to ask yourself, what is essential in your life? If you're an essentialist, you say, what is essential? What is fundamentally important to me? And then you've got to be ruthless at removing everything in your life that's non-essential. Well, I think that this is the first book I've written where I actually applied that. I became ruthless about removing everything that was not fundamental to the idea of the gap and the gain. And that's different for me because I'm one of those types of people who like to stretch ideas and see how far they can go. I like to see how far I can take things. And thankfully, Dan Tucker Max, who was the editor of the book, and other people were able to tell me, this doesn't fit. This isn't helping the ultimate cause. When you're writing something, you want to have a golden thread. You want to be clear on what is the center concept, and everything needs to serve that center concept. I believe in my other books, I was pretty good at writing what was essential, but I believe that there was probably extraneous things. Even Stephen King said you want to cut, kill your darlings. Your darlings are your ideas that you love, that ultimately are things you like, but they don't serve the purpose of the book. And I believe that this is the first book I've ever truly written where everything in the book absolutely is essential. There may even be 1 or 2 things in there that could have been cut, maybe that didn't make the cut. I love the quote, when in doubt, leave it out. But if I actually look at the book, if I look at the structure, and if I look at the core ideas, it's pretty clean. It's pretty essential. I recently wrote the conclusion of the book, and we had to cut it because I was trying too far to step it into new ideas, and everyone was like, nope, this has got to be a clear conclusion that draws it straight back to the beginning and re-emphasizes the core ideas. Stop trying to add new ideas. Actually clarify what's truly here. And so this is, I believe, is my first book with a pure intro and a pure conclusion where it all builds together and gets wrapped up in a bow, and everything in there is a core idea. There's nothing extraneous. And, you know, there's that great idea that there's the quote that says, if I had had more time, I would have written you something shorter. I would have written a little letter. Something's length doesn't mean it's good. Something's clarity, specificity, and centeredness is what makes it good. And this is a shorter book than I wanted it to be. It's shorter than it was going to be. And even James Clear wrote the blockbuster book Atomic Habits. He said that he ultimately, I think, deleted like 250,000 words to boil it down to what became Atomic Habits. And so you've got to be willing to cut, and serve only the purpose of the book, serve only the purpose of the reader. And I think that was a lesson I truly learned a lot deeper by writing this book. The 5th and final lesson, and I learned many other lessons writing this book, but another lesson, a 5th lesson that I learned was that the gain is ultimately how you make progress as a person. It's only by measuring your own gains that you can start truly making progress. So as Dan Sullivan would say it, the gain is where you measure yourself backwards against where you were before. The gap is when you're measuring yourself against some ideal in your mind or some reference point that's outside of yourself. And people who are measuring themselves in the gap are never happy because they're pursuing happiness. They're seeking happiness outside of themselves. And we live in an American-driven culture, or even a Western culture, where we're trained to pursue happiness. We're striving for happiness rather than realizing that happiness is based on our own progress and that happiness is internal, not external. Happiness is a one-player game, as Naval Ravikant would say. And so When you start measuring your own progress and actually start genuinely reflecting on where am I right now versus where I was before, and what are the gains and progress I've actually made over the last year, 5 years, what are the gains I've made? Once you start measuring your gains, then and only then can you start making true and genuine progress. Then you've made your reference point internal, which means your happiness is internal, and then you're playing your own game rather than living someone else's game. Then you can start making the right gains, and then you can actually start making exponential gains. Because in the psychology world, there's a concept called selective attention, and selective attention means that how you see anything is how you see everything. In other words, you've trained your worldview what to see, what to focus on, what to care about. And when you start measuring your own gains and seeing and appreciating your own gains, then you start wanting to see and create more gains. And then you can start becoming way more self-directed. And then you can start making massive exponential gains. The other thing that comes of measuring your own gains is that you become more unique as a person. What I mean by unique is that you become more who you truly are. When you start measuring your own progress and you start making yourself the reference point, and when you start actually measuring your own gains and you stop measuring yourself and competing with other people, then you truly become unique. Then your goals become more self-directed, you become more self-determined, you become more intrinsically motivated. And so you become more who you are as a person. Whereas if you're not self-determined, if you have external reference points, then you're kind of a chameleon of your environment. You're a chameleon of your peer group or of the ideals of society, because you're chasing success based on what other people have determined. Whereas once you start measuring your own gains, making yourself the reference point and becoming self-determined, you become unique, because then you start having really cool progress and it starts becoming your own, and you start setting your own goals, and it stops being extrinsically motivated. You stop caring what other people think, and you start really becoming a unique, very different individual. You also become an outlier, because you're no longer playing the game that everyone else is playing. You're now playing your own game. So now you're completely in a unique world. You're playing a unique game. You're becoming a unique person. And so the gain is not only how you make massive progress, but it's also how you become a unique individual and stop being a chameleon of the ideals of society. It's where you can start living your own life, becoming an outlier, and start truly becoming intrinsically motivated and start being who you really want to be as a person. Self-generated, self-created, and self-referencing. So those are just some of the powerful lessons I learned from writing The Gap and the Gain. Again, down below you can get the free version. This is Dan's original version. This is an idea he created like 25 years ago. Down below is also the link to the version that me and Dan created, which comes out in October through Hay House. Hope sharing these ideas was useful. Talk to you later.